People always say your life can change in a second, but for Ava, it wasn't a second. It was a slow, creeping realization that everything she had built wasn't as solid as it seemed. That morning felt like any other. The sun was already peeking through the blinds when she stirred under the thick quilt, the apartment still holding on to the early chill of spring. Her husband, Brandon, was already gone, as usual, probably at the gym or grabbing an early coffee before his meetings. For most people, that would seem normal, just another day starting. But Ava had been feeling it for months. The quiet tension, the way his kisses felt more like routines, the cold space in bed that used to be warm with laughter and tangled legs. She tried to ignore it. She told herself it was just stress, just marriage being what marriage becomes after 7 years. But on that morning, as she stood barefoot in the kitchen, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring blankly at her phone, something shifted. A notification blinked across the top of her screen, a name she didn't recognize, paired with a message preview that made her stomach turn. She didn't even click on it right away. She just froze, her thumb hovering, heart pounding like it had been waiting for this moment all along. Ava had always been the kind of woman who trusted too much. She believed in honesty, in giving people space, in letting things breathe. But when she finally opened the message, the air seemed to get sucked out of the room. It wasn't one message, it was a chain. Photos, texts, voice notes. A woman named Camille, apparently unaware, or maybe fully aware, of Ava's existence, had sent everything. She said she was tired of being lied to, tired of waiting for Brandon to leave his wife, tired of pretending she didn't exist. Ava didn't cry. That's what surprised her most. She just felt empty, like her body had gone into shutdown mode to keep her from breaking apart. She read every word, watched every video, listened to every whispered promise. Her knees didn't buckle. She didn't scream. She just sat down on the kitchen floor and stared at the tiles, trying to process the magnitude of what had just shattered, because it wasn't just betrayal. It was the quiet death of the story she had believed in for so long. The minutes crawled by as Ava remained on that cold kitchen floor, her phone beside her like a loaded weapon she had accidentally discharged. The apartment was still and quiet, but in her head everything buzzed. Memories, questions, pieces of a puzzle that now made cruel sense. She remembered the business trips that seemed too convenient, the late-night showers, the way Brandon started locking his phone with a password after years of never needing one. All those small, nagging doubts she had pushed aside in favor of trust. They came rushing back like a flood. She hated how clearly she could now see the signs. But more than anything, she hated herself for ignoring them. She wasn't naive, not really. She had just wanted to believe in him, in them. They had built a life together, a home filled with framed pictures from vacations, carefully curated bookshelves, and shared grocery lists on the fridge. Now all those things looked like props from a play that had ended without warning. She felt like an actress who had forgotten her lines in the middle of a performance, standing alone on stage with the spotlight burning her skin. By noon, Ava had gone through the entire message history 3 times. Every reread carved the betrayal deeper, but she couldn't stop. She needed to feel it fully, as if facing the pain would give her clarity, or maybe some twisted sense of control. Her phone buzzed again. Brandon this time. Just a simple, "Hey babe, you good?" It made her want to laugh and scream at the same time. How dare he? How could he walk around acting like nothing was happening? She didn't answer. Instead, she threw on a coat over her pajamas and walked out the door without even knowing where she was going. She just needed air, real, sharp, unfiltered air. She walked down their street, past familiar houses and neighbors she suddenly felt disconnected from. The world looked the same, but nothing was. With each step, she asked herself the same impossible question. What now? Because what do you do when the person who was your safe place becomes the one who burned it all down? Ava ended up in a park she barely remembered existed, one of those small green corners tucked between rows of brownstone buildings. The playground was empty, just a lonely swing swaying gently in the breeze. She sat on a bench and tried to breathe, really breathe, like her therapist once taught her when anxiety started creeping in. But today it wasn't creeping, it was flooding. The betrayal wasn't just about sex or lies. It was about the years she spent believing they were building something meaningful. It was the way she supported him through job changes, cheered him on at every milestone, forgave the small hurts, thinking they were part of growing together. And now it felt like he had cashed in every piece of her trust for the thrill of something new. She stared at the cracked pavement beneath her shoes and tried to imagine what her life looked like from the outside. A woman sitting alone in a park, eyes swollen from holding back tears, trying to figure out how to start over when she never planned to end anything. She stayed there for hours. The temperature dropped, but she didn't feel the cold. People walked by, dog owners, joggers, a couple laughing loudly. But Ava was wrapped in her own bubble of silence. Eventually, she took out her phone again and scrolled through Brandon's old messages, the ones before Camille, back when things felt right, when he called her his world, when they made plans to buy a cottage by the lake. It felt like reading someone else's story. She wondered if any of it had been real or if Brandon had just been saying what he knew would keep her close. And then, a strange thought hit her. This wasn't the first time she felt like she was watching her life from the outside. There had been other moments, smaller ones when she felt invisible in her own marriage. Times when she smiled through dinners alone or brushed off the excuses. Maybe this wasn't a sudden disaster. Maybe it had been unraveling all along, and today was just the day it all came undone in the open. By the time Ava returned home, it was already dark. The city lights bounced off the windows, casting fractured reflections on the living room walls. Everything inside the apartment looked exactly the same, but it felt like stepping into a stranger's life. The couch where they used to curl up and binge-watch shows, the wine glasses still drying on the rack, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the hallway. It all felt like mockery. She moved slowly, almost mechanically, as if her body wasn't hers anymore. The silence was heavy now, not peaceful like it used to be. When Brandon finally walked through the door, carrying a paper bag with Thai takeout and humming a tune, Ava just stared at him. He froze when he saw her. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, fear, maybe both. He opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand. She didn't want an explanation. Not yet, not a speech. She needed the truth to breathe in the room like smoke so she could finally see how toxic it had all become. She walked past him without a word and went straight to the bedroom. That space had once been their sanctuary, filled with whispered jokes, late-night talks, and shared dreams. Now it was just a room with a bed they no longer shared in spirit. She sat down on the edge and waited. A few seconds later, Brandon followed, cautiously, like he was stepping into a minefield. "Ava, he began, voice low, but again she stopped him with her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she saw him not as her husband, but as a man she no longer knew. "How long?" she asked. Just that. 2 words. He hesitated. She saw the calculations behind his silence. How much should he admit? What version would hurt less? Eventually, he muttered, "A year." It was like getting punched in the chest. A full year of her life spent in a lie. Ava didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that single truth. It was enough for now. She didn't need to hear why. She only needed to know how deep the betrayal went, and it went all the way through. Brandon tried to explain after that. He paced the room, stammering about confusion, about how things hadn't been right between them for a while, how he never meant to fall for someone else. The words spilled out like a rehearsed monologue, and Ava just sat there, unmoved. His voice sounded distant, like a background noise she could choose to mute at any moment. She watched him, not with anger, but with a sort of stunned detachment, as if she were studying a man who had once been important to her in another life. The most painful part wasn't what he said. It was how well he said it, like he had done this in his head many times before, like he had practiced how he'd spin this moment into something more forgivable. Ava wasn't interested in forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. When he paused to gauge her reaction, she looked him straight in the eye and said, "You didn't just cheat on me. You replaced me." The words landed hard. He flinched, and for the first time that night, he didn't have anything to say. She slept on the couch that night, not because he asked her to, but because being near him felt unbearable. The cushions were stiff, her back ached, and sleep didn't come easy. But she preferred discomfort over sharing space with someone who had broken her trust so completely. At some point in the early morning hours, she heard him crying in the bedroom. Soft, choked sobs that might have moved her once, but now they just made her feel numb. She didn't hate him, not yet at least. Hate required too much energy. What she felt was a hollow sort of grief, the kind that wraps around your bones and makes everything feel heavy. The life she thought they had was gone, and in its place was a timeline full of doubts. Every anniversary, every gift, every memory was now tainted with the possibility that it had been a lie. And that was the real heartbreak. Not just losing him, but losing the version of herself who believed in what they had. The next morning, Ava didn't say a word to Brandon. She showered, got dressed, and left the apartment without looking back. Her phone buzzed with his texts, variations of "Can we talk?" and "Please don't shut me out." But she didn't answer. Instead, she drove to her sister's place on the other side of the city. Sophie opened the door, still in pajamas, hair a mess, clutching a coffee mug. When she saw Ava's face, she didn't ask anything. She just pulled her into a hug and held on. That small act of love undid her. For the first time since reading those messages, Ava cried. Not the silent tears she let slip while alone, but the full-body sobs that shake something loose inside you. Sophie didn't ask questions. She made tea, brought out a blanket, and sat with Ava on the couch as she poured out the entire story. Every ugly, painful detail. It felt like lancing a wound, horrible, but necessary. And for the first time, Ava didn't feel alone in it. She felt seen. That day at Sophie's marked a turning point, even if it didn't feel like one right away. Ava spent the next few days there, barely checking her phone, ignoring Brandon's increasingly desperate attempts to reach her. She wasn't ready for closure, or forgiveness, or even confrontation. What she needed was space, to think, to breathe, to figure out who she was without him. Sophie helped in ways Ava hadn't known she needed. She reminded her to eat, pulled her into walks around the neighborhood, sat beside her in silence when the weight of everything made words feel impossible. It was a kind of healing that didn't announce itself. It just slowly, quietly began. Ava started to sleep again, even if the dreams were jagged. She stopped rereading the messages. She deleted the photos, not because she had made peace with it all, but because clinging to the proof didn't undo the betrayal. Every morning she woke up in that spare bedroom with the creaky window and sunlight that filtered in like hope. She felt a little more like herself. Not the Ava who loved Brandon blindly, but someone new, someone bruised, but still breathing. By the 5th day, Ava finally answered one of Brandon's calls. Not because she was ready, but because she was tired of running from the sound of his name lighting up her screen. He sounded different, not just sad, but small. He asked if she was okay, if she was safe, if there was any chance they could talk face to face. Ava said yes, but only in public. She didn't trust herself, or him, in the apartment that had become the scene of too many ghosts. They met at a quiet coffee shop a few blocks from their place. When he walked in, he looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. His eyes were puffy, his clothes wrinkled, and for once, he didn't lead with excuses. He sat down and said, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I know I destroyed everything." And for a moment, Ava almost believed he understood. But as he kept talking, circling back to his unhappiness, to how lost he'd felt, to how he never meant to hurt her, the anger finally caught up with her grief. She cut him off mid-sentence. "Do you even hear yourself?" she asked. "You're not sorry for cheating. You're sorry you got caught." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, sharper than she'd ever sounded with him, and it stunned him. Ava had never been confrontational. She had always been the peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who gave second chances. But not this time. She told him how he made her feel invisible, how every lie chipped away at her self-worth, how the version of her he left behind wasn't someone she ever wanted to be again. Brandon didn't interrupt. He just listened, and maybe that was the only decent thing he did in all of it. When she stood to leave, she didn't promise anything. Not reconciliation, not closure, not even another conversation. She just said, "Take care of yourself, Brandon." And then she walked out, head high, heart aching, but with the unmistakable feeling that she had reclaimed something she didn't even know she had lost. In the weeks that followed, Ava started rediscovering her life. Not the one tied to Brandon, but the one that had always belonged to her, even if she hadn't realized it. She went back to the yoga studio she'd stopped visiting when her schedule became all about us time. She signed up for a weekend pottery class on a whim, something she'd always said she'd try someday. She even started journaling again, scribbling thoughts and memories and questions she couldn't yet say out loud. It wasn't some magical transformation where everything fell into place overnight. There were still bad days, days when she missed the familiarity of him, the rhythm of a shared life, even if it was built on cracks. But she learned to sit with those feelings instead of running from them. Grief, she realized, wasn't a straight line. It came in waves, and all she could do was ride them without drowning. One afternoon, while cleaning out the closet at Sophie's house, Ava found an old photo album from college. In it, she saw a version of herself she had forgotten, carefree, confident, full of plans that had nothing to do with being someone's wife. She stared at one picture in particular, her standing on a beach in a thrifted sundress, laughing with her eyes closed, arms wide open to the sky. That girl hadn't been afraid to start over. That girl believed in new beginnings, in the power of her own choices. Ava closed the album and took a deep breath. Maybe healing wasn't about going back to who she was before Brandon. Maybe it was about becoming someone stronger, wiser, and more rooted in her own worth. That evening, she told Sophie she was ready to go home, not to fix things with him, but to reclaim her space, her life, her voice. Coming back to the apartment was harder than Ava expected. The moment she stepped through the door, a wave of memories crashed over her. The place looked the same, but everything felt different, emptier, quieter, almost sterile. Brandon wasn't there. They had agreed he would stay with a friend until she decided what she wanted to do next. For now, it was hers again. Just hers. She walked through each room slowly, letting herself feel everything. The betrayal, the sorrow, the confusion, and oddly, a sense of pride for having made it this far. She opened the windows, changed the sheets, boxed up a few of his things, and lit a candle that reminded her of calm evenings before everything had gone off the rails. It wasn't a dramatic cleansing or some symbolic ritual. It was just Ava, in her own space, trying to figure out how to breathe again without someone else's weight in the air. That first night back, she didn't cry. She made herself dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta with garlic and olive oil, and sat at the small kitchen table with a book she'd been meaning to read for months. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was hers. She wasn't okay yet, and she knew that. There were still pieces to sort through, boundaries to set, and a future she hadn't yet mapped out. But she had taken the first real step in choosing herself. That mattered. Later, she found herself standing in front of the mirror, studying her own face. The sadness was still there, sure, but so was something else. Resolve. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like someone's wife or someone's mistake. She just felt like Ava. And that was enough for now. Ava didn't tell many people what had happened, not because she was ashamed, but because she didn't owe the world her pain. She confided in Sophie, and that was enough. The rest could speculate or gossip if they wanted. Ava had more important things to focus on than managing other people's opinions. One afternoon, while walking through a local bookstore, she ran into Maya, an old friend from college she hadn't seen in years. They exchanged polite smiles, the kind that carry 1,000 unspoken questions. Maya asked how she'd been, and Ava hesitated. Then, without giving too much away, she said, "Starting over." Maya didn't pry. Instead, she nodded with genuine understanding and said, "Me too." That moment stayed with Ava for the rest of the day. It reminded her that pain wasn't a private club and that people were constantly rebuilding behind the scenes of what looked like normal lives. She wasn't alone in this mess. And that thought, as simple as it was, brought her comfort. As the weeks passed, Ava began documenting her healing process, not online, not for validation, but privately, in a journal she kept hidden in the drawer by her bed. She wrote letters to herself, to Brandon, even to the woman he'd betrayed her with, not to send them, but to empty her mind of the thoughts that kept circling. She wrote about her anger, but also her guilt, how part of her still wondered if she could have done something differently to prevent it all. Deep down, she knew that kind of thinking was a trap. Brandon made his choices. She wasn't responsible for his failure, to be honest. But unraveling years of emotional conditioning took time. Her therapist helped her see that. In their sessions, Ava learned to stop minimizing her own needs, to stop bending to accommodate someone else's comfort while neglecting her own. It was uncomfortable work, exposing old wounds, digging through forgotten parts of herself, but it was also liberating. She began to understand that the version of love she had accepted for so long was never really love at all. It had been familiarity, habit, fear of being alone. And now that she had none of that, she realized she had everything she actually needed: clarity, space, and the courage to begin again on her own terms. One morning, Ava woke up before sunrise, something she hadn't done in years without an alarm. The light creeping through the blinds had a softness to it, and for once she didn't feel the heaviness of dread sitting on her chest. She slipped on a sweater, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat by the window in silence, watching the city come to life. It was such a small moment, but it struck her deeply. How peaceful her life had become without the noise of someone else's chaos clouding her mind. For so long, she had oriented her world around someone who didn't even see her fully. Now, everything was shifting inward. Her routines were hers. Her mornings were hers. Her thoughts were no longer crowded by suspicion or confusion. There was freedom in that solitude, even if it sometimes ached. She realized she didn't miss Brandon anymore. What she missed was the illusion of partnership, the safety she thought she had. But the truth was, she had been doing the emotional heavy lifting alone for far too long. She began taking long walks with no destination, often ending up in corners of the city she had forgotten existed. One day she found a small park tucked behind a community center, quiet and shaded, with a broken bench under a sprawling oak tree. She sat there with her journal, writing page after page without filtering herself. For the first time in what felt like forever, her writing wasn't about pain, it was about possibility. She jotted down goals, no matter how small or impractical. Take a solo trip, learn to cook something completely new, dance in public without caring who's watching. These weren't dramatic gestures meant to prove her strength to the world. They were gentle promises to herself, reminders that her life didn't end with Brandon's betrayal. It began after it. She thought back to that moment on the kitchen floor, the numbness, the silence. And now, just a few months later, she felt the stirrings of joy again. Not the overwhelming kind that sweeps you off your feet, but the subtle kind that returns in bits and pieces, like sunlight filtering through leaves. That joy didn't come from fixing anything. It came from surviving what broke her, and realizing she never needed someone else to feel whole. Ava eventually returned to work, not because she had to, but because she was ready. Her co-workers noticed a change, not in her appearance, but in her presence. She was quieter, more focused, yet somehow more grounded than she had ever been before. She didn't talk about what happened with Brandon unless someone asked directly, and even then, she kept it short. We separated. It was time. No bitterness, no dramatics, just truth, plain and steady. The office used to be a place where she buried herself to escape the cracks in her home life. Now it became a space where she reconnected with her ambition, her intellect, and the parts of herself that had been dulled by years of emotional labor. She volunteered to lead a project, something she hadn't done since early in her marriage, and surprised herself with how naturally she stepped back into that leadership role. She had forgotten what it felt like to trust her own decisions without second-guessing every move. Each small win at work began to rebuild her confidence, brick by brick. Outside of work, Ava kept her circle small. She met new people through her pottery class, connected with an old neighbor over shared walks, and even went on a casual coffee date someone had suggested, just to see how it felt. She didn't expect fireworks or deep emotional connection, and she didn't get it. But that wasn't the point. The point was that she went, that she listened to herself, that she allowed someone else into her space without losing her own footing. She smiled when she wanted to, ended the date when she felt like it, and walked away without any pressure to define what came next. And it felt good. Not because the man was charming or because the date was perfect. It wasn't. But because Ava was no longer seeking validation in someone else's eyes. She was learning that she could enjoy her own company, define her own pace, and decide her own worth. That realization, more than anything, was the beginning of something new, something she could build, not with desperation or fear, but with patience and love for herself. For the first time in years, Ava wasn't chasing anything. She was just living, and that in itself was everything. Months passed, and the season began to shift again. The trees outside her window turned from green to amber, and with every leaf that fell, Ava felt herself letting go of something she no longer needed. She didn't talk to Brandon anymore. After their coffee shop meeting, there were a few more attempts on his part. An email here, a voicemail there, but eventually even he seemed to realize she had moved on. And she had. Not just physically, but emotionally. Spiritually, she wasn't carrying him with her anymore. He had become a closed chapter, a lesson written into the pages of her story with sharp ink and final punctuation. And though the pain hadn't vanished, it had softened. Some mornings she would still wake up with a heaviness in her chest, but it no longer controlled her day. She could acknowledge it, breathe through it, and keep moving. She found herself laughing more, and not the forced kind she used to practice in front of other couples. This laughter was real, born from little things, a joke at work, a silly video, a clumsy misstep in pottery class. Ava's world wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She had slowly built new routines that made her feel safe and seen. Morning walks to her favorite cafe, weekend trips to the farmer's market, quiet nights at home with a book and tea. There was a comfort in the simplicity she never appreciated when her life was wrapped in the complications of loving someone who didn't know how to love her back. She no longer measured her value through someone else's eyes. And that shift, subtle at first, became everything. One evening, she sat on her balcony, wrapped in a blanket, watching the city hum quietly beneath her. A neighbor played soft music. A breeze moved through the trees. And for the first time since that morning in the kitchen, Ava didn't think about what had been taken from her. She thought about what she had reclaimed. She didn't need a dramatic ending or a grand new love to make her story worth telling. The beauty of it all was in the return, to herself, to her strength, to the life she had the courage to rebuild from nothing. She realized then that sometimes survival itself is the most powerful kind of transformation. One weekend in late November, Ava took a spontaneous trip to the coast. It was a quiet beach town she had once visited with Brandon years ago, but this time she chose to see it through her own lens, on her own terms. She booked a small inn, packed a suitcase with her favorite sweater and a stack of unread books, and drove alone with no music, just the hum of the road and her own thoughts for company. When she arrived, the air was crisp and salty, the kind that clears your head just by breathing it in. She walked the shore at sunrise, the waves brushing against her boots, and felt something release. She didn't cry. She didn't dwell on the past. She simply stood there, wrapped in the wind and stillness, and felt present in a way she hadn't for years. That moment didn't offer closure, because closure, she realized, isn't a moment. It's a series of quiet choices. It's waking up and choosing yourself every single day, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. She returned from the trip with sand still stuck to the bottom of her bag, and a renewed clarity in her chest. The world hadn't changed, but she had. She no longer needed to explain her journey to anyone, or justify why she stayed so long or why she walked away. That was the part people rarely understood, how complicated it is to leave something you've built your life around, even when it's breaking you. But Ava didn't care who understood anymore. She understood. That was enough. She began documenting her experience anonymously online, sharing parts of her story in forums with others who were navigating similar heartbreaks. Not for sympathy, but to remind someone else sitting on their kitchen floor that they weren't alone. That healing didn't mean erasing the past. It meant learning to live beyond it. And as she typed out her story, paragraph by paragraph, she didn't glamorize the pain or dress it up for drama. She told the truth, the hard, messy, beautiful truth, and in doing so, she felt her voice return, not just as a whisper of survival, but as a full, steady presence. Her story wasn't over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. Weeks later, Ava received a message from a stranger on the forum where she had been sharing parts of her journey. It was short, just a few lines, but it stopped her in her tracks. "I read your post. I've been sitting in the same silence for months thinking no one else understood. Thank you. You reminded me I'm not crazy for still loving someone who hurt me, but also that I deserve more." Ava sat there, phone in hand, tears welling up, not from pain this time, but from a deep, quiet recognition. She hadn't expected anything from sharing her story, but to know that her words, born from the worst kind of heartbreak, had helped someone else feel a little less alone, that mattered. She realized then that healing isn't just about what you do for yourself, but also what you leave behind for others. Her pain had found a purpose beyond itself. It had created a connection, however small, that extended far beyond the four walls of her apartment or the confines of her old life. That night, she pulled out her journal again, not to vent or relive the hurt, but to write herself a letter. Not the broken version, not the grieving wife, but the woman who stood tall in the aftermath. She wrote about her strength, her softness, her ability to endure without becoming bitter. She reminded herself of the nights she survived, the days she got out of bed when everything felt hollow, the decisions she made even when she was terrified, and she thanked herself for not giving up, for choosing to stay, not in the relationship, but in life. She ended the letter with a promise. No matter what happens next, I will never abandon myself again. It was simple, but it was everything, because the most important relationship she would ever have was the one with herself, and that was finally, fully intact. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into her journal, and went to bed, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because, after everything, she had found her way home. It's been a year now. Ava doesn't mark the day on a calendar, doesn't light a candle or pour a glass of wine in remembrance. But sometimes in the quiet moments, brushing her teeth before bed, walking to the corner cafe, folding laundry with music playing low in the background, she remembers, not with pain, not with longing, but with a kind of detached gratitude. That morning in the kitchen, the message, the collapse of everything she believed in, it had all been the beginning of a version of herself she hadn't met yet. She no longer defines that chapter by Brandon's betrayal, but by her own return. Her return to agency, to intuition, to self-respect. There are still scars, of course, but they don't sting the way they used to. They remind her that she survived, that she walked through fire and kept going. She doesn't look for love the same way anymore. She's open to it, yes, but she no longer believes it has to cost her her peace. She knows now that the right kind of love won't ask her to shrink. It will meet her where she stands. And for those who ask how she made it through, Ava doesn't give advice or recite quotes. She just tells her story, plain, honest, and unfiltered, because she knows someone, somewhere, is standing in their kitchen right now, phone in hand, wondering how everything fell apart so quickly. And maybe, just maybe, if they hear her truth, they'll find the strength to stand up, to walk out the door, to choose themselves. Ava still writes on that forum from time to time, usually late at night when her thoughts are clearest. She never reveals her real name, but her words speak louder than any signature could. And every now and then someone will reply with the same message. Your story helped me. That's enough. That's more than enough. Because in telling it, she didn't just reclaim her own voice. She handed someone else a flashlight in the dark. And that, in the end, is how Ava changed. Not with a dramatic gesture, but with the quiet, unwavering decision to never again abandon herself. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. More stories like Ava's are waiting to be told, and maybe, just maybe, one of them will be yours.